The morning started like any other coffee steaming on my porch, the hum of cicadas rising with the heat. But then Karen showed up, clipboard in hand, eyes burning with self-righteous fury. She waved a fine notice in my face, claiming I owed the HOA hundreds for some imaginary violation. I laughed it off, refusing to pay a dime. That's when she dialed 911, thinking she could scare me. What she didn't know was that the storm she unleashed would come crashing down on her own house. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. I remember the day it all started as if it were burned into my memory. The morning sun was spilling gold across the hills behind my house, and I was sitting on my porch, sipping black coffee from the same old mug I'd used for 20 years. That's when I saw Karen, our self-appointed HOA queen, marching down my driveway like she was invading enemy territory. She had that clipboard in one hand and a scowl on her face so deep it looked like it was carved in stone. "Mr. Thompson," she barked, not bothering to greet me, "you've been fined $300 for violating community guidelines. Your lawn is 2 inches over regulation height." I stared at her, stunned for a second, before setting down my coffee. 2 inches, I asked, tilting my head. "Karen, it's July. Grass grows. That's what it does." Her face twisted as if I'd insulted her entire family tree. "Rules are rules," she snapped, waving the paper like it was the word of God. "You have 10 days to pay this fine, or further action will be taken." I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but I forced a smile. "I'm not paying a dime, Karen. That's my land, and I'll cut my lawn when it needs cutting. Not when you say so." She opened her mouth to argue, but I simply turned and walked back into my house, leaving her standing there like a general who'd just lost a battle. That was the first time I realized how far Karen was willing to go to control every inch of this neighborhood, but I had no idea just how ugly things would get. Later that day, I heard her outside, talking loudly to one of the neighbors, an older man named George. I didn't want to eavesdrop, but her voice carried like a siren. "He thinks he's above the rules," she said, no doubt talking about me. "If he doesn't pay, I'll make an example of him." George saw me through the window and gave me a look that said, "She's crazy." He'd been on the receiving end of her power trips before, over things as small as leaving his trash can out an hour too long. This was the first time I realized I wasn't alone. Karen had been running the HOA like a dictator for years, and most people were too tired or too scared to fight her. That night, I sat down at my kitchen table, spreading the so-called fine notice across the surface. The document was a mess, no signature from any other HOA board member, no proof of any formal vote, just Karen's handwriting and a bold stamp she'd probably bought at the office supply store. I knew then and there I wasn't going to let this slide. If she wanted a war, I was ready to give her one. The next day, I decided to test her bluff. I left my lawn exactly as it was, 2 inches over her regulation limit, and spent the afternoon grilling steaks out back. When Karen stormed past my fence, her lips pressed tight. I just raised my beer in her direction with a grin. She didn't like that. I could practically see the steam coming out of her ears. That evening, I got 3 emails from her within an hour. The first demanded payment of the fine. The second warned me of legal consequences. The third, well, that one was pure, "Karen, if you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to escalate this matter. The HOA will not tolerate rebellion." I nearly spit out my drink laughing. Rebellion. It was grass, not treason. I didn't know it then, but my refusal to bend to her would light a fuse that would eventually blow up her entire empire. At the time, though, all I knew was that I wasn't about to hand over my hard-earned money for something so absurd. I wasn't raised that way. My father taught me to stand my ground when I'm right, even if it means standing alone. But I wasn't alone, not really. The next morning, George stopped by, leaning on my fence with that weary look of his. "Heard she tried to shake you down." He said, "Don't give in. She's been running this place like her own little kingdom. Maybe it's time someone fought back." I nodded, a grin spreading across my face. Then I guess I'm the guy for the job. As the week went on, Karen's tactics escalated. She started snapping photos of my house, my yard, even my truck parked in my own driveway, like she was gathering evidence for some grand trial. It was laughable, but I could tell she thought she was untouchable, and in her mind, maybe she was. But in reality, she was digging her own grave, one threat at a time. By the end of that week, I knew I had a choice: either cave in and pay the fine like everyone else had done before me, or stand tall and expose her for the bully she really was. I chose the latter. What I didn't know was that Karen's next move would involve a stunt so outrageous it would bring the entire neighborhood to a standstill. Karen didn't take my refusal lightly. By the time the weekend rolled around, she had turned what should have been a simple disagreement into a full-scale campaign. It wasn't just about my lawn anymore. She was on a mission to break me. The first sign of trouble came on Saturday morning. I was patching up a section of my fence when I saw Karen walking door to door with that same clipboard, whispering to neighbors like a politician hunting for votes. Every time she pointed toward my house, I could see her expression harden. It wasn't hard to guess what she was saying. "Don't mind her," George said when I asked. "She's trying to rally the whole street against you. Last year, she tried the same nonsense with the Ramirez family over their garden gnomes. Nearly made them move." That's when it hit me. Karen thrived on fear. If she could scare people into paying ridiculous fines or following arbitrary rules, she could maintain her little empire. But I wasn't about to let her win. That night, I found 3 more letters stuffed into my mailbox, each one angrier than the last. Letter 1. Failure to comply with HOA standards will result in additional fines of $50 per day. Letter 2. Your lawn height is a violation of community pride and aesthetics. Immediate payment is required. Letter 3. Final warning. We will escalate to legal measures. I laughed out loud reading the last one. Legal measures over grass. Karen must have been losing her mind. Still, I knew her persistence wasn't just a bluff. She was the kind of person who'd make my life miserable just to prove a point. On Sunday, I decided to confront her directly. I walked across the street, knocking on her front door. She answered with a smile so fake it nearly cracked her face. "Karen," I said calmly, "we need to talk." She crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "There's nothing to talk about. Mr. Thompson, you've broken the rules, and the HOA doesn't tolerate people who think they're above them." I couldn't help but smirk. "Karen, this HOA isn't you. And as far as I can see, you don't have the authority to slap me with fake fines. If you want to take me to court, go ahead. But I promise you, you'll lose." The color drained from her face for just a moment before she recovered, jabbing a finger in my direction. "You'll regret this. I'll have the whole neighborhood behind me." "Then you'd better make sure the whole neighborhood knows the truth," I said, turning to leave, "because I'm done playing your game." The very next morning, I noticed something strange. Karen had put up a giant notice board at the entrance of the neighborhood, plastered with my name in bold letters: "Resident in violation, failure to pay HOA fine." I stopped my truck right there in the street, staring at the sign with disbelief. It looked like something out of a Wild West wanted poster. If her goal was to humiliate me, she'd picked the wrong guy. George came by later that day, chuckling. Saw the sign. She's really losing it. "Yeah," I said, shaking my head. "She's turning this into a circus, but if she wants a fight, she's going to get one." That afternoon, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started documenting everything, every letter, every sign, every petty threat Karen threw my way. I knew that if things went south, I'd need proof of her harassment. Meanwhile, other neighbors began quietly reaching out to me. "She fined us last year for parking too close to the curb." One couple admitted, "We paid just to make her go away. But honestly, we wish we'd stood up to her like you are." Their words lit a fire in me. This wasn't just about my lawn anymore. It was about the way Karen had bullied everyone into submission, and I wasn't going to let it continue. A few days later, Karen escalated her tactics again. This time, she called a special HOA meeting and invited me to attend. Of course, her invitation came with another threat. Failure to appear will result in further penalties. I showed up at that meeting wearing my best boots, a clean button-up shirt, and the calmest expression I could muster. The room was full of neighbors. most of them looking uncomfortable as Karen ranted about how I was destroying the harmony of the neighborhood. When she finally gave me the floor, I stood tall and said, "Folks, this is about more than a lawn. It's about whether we're going to let one person control our lives with threats and fake fines. I'm not paying because I don't owe her a thing, and neither do you." The room was silent for a moment. Then I saw George nod, followed by a couple of others. Karen's face went pale. For the first time, she realized her grip on this community might be slipping. That night, she sent me one last email short, cold, and dripping with anger. "You've made a big mistake. I will handle this my way." I didn't know what she meant at the time, but by the next morning, I'd find out, and it would involve blue flashing lights in my driveway. The next morning, I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when I heard tires screeching outside my house. I walked to the window, and, sure enough, there was Karen, storming out of her white SUV with her phone already pressed to her ear. Her face was red, her steps sharp. She looked like a woman on a mission. I stepped onto the porch, leaning against the railing. "What now, Karen?" I called out, my voice calm but firm. She pointed at me like she was a sheriff in an old Western. "You've had your final warning. Mr. Thompson, I'm calling 911. You're refusing to comply with HOA rules, and I consider this harassment of the community. I almost choked on my coffee." "You're calling the police over grass?" I asked, incredulous. "Yes," she barked, pacing in front of my driveway. "You're a danger to the neighborhood's standards. The police will make you comply." I couldn't help but laugh. "Karen, the police don't care about your HOA rules." "But sure, go ahead. This should be fun." 10 minutes later, a squad car rolled up, lights flashing. My neighbors had already started gathering across the street, some leaning on their fences, others peeking from behind curtains. Karen stood there, arms crossed like she was about to deliver the victory speech of her life. The officer stepped out, adjusting his hat as he walked toward us. "Morning," he said, looking between me and Karen. "We got a call about a lawn dispute." Karen rushed forward like a contestant on a game show. "Officer, this man refuses to comply with our HOA rules. He's ruining the entire look of our community. I demand you ticket him or make him pay the fine." The officer glanced at my lawn, then at me, clearly confused. "Sir, is there some kind of legal issue here?" I handed him the crumpled fine notice Karen had given me. "No legal issue, officer. Just an HOA president who thinks she's above the law." The officer skimmed the paper, raising an eyebrow. "Ma'am," he said, turning to Karen, "this isn't a police matter. We don't enforce HOA bylaws. That's a civil issue, not criminal." Karen's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. "What do you mean he's violating the rules?" "Ma'am," the officer said firmly, "you can't call 911 for things like this. It's not an emergency. In fact, this is bordering on misuse of emergency services." The crowd behind us started to whisper, and I caught George smirking. I almost felt bad for Karen, almost. "Officer," I said with a polite nod, "thank you for coming. I think we're done here." The officer gave me a look that said, "Hang in there," before turning back to Karen. "This is your final warning. Ma'am, don't call 911 for non-emergencies like this again." With that, he got back into his car and drove off, leaving Karen standing there, speechless. That afternoon, the whole neighborhood was buzzing. I could hear snippets of conversation every time I stepped outside. "Did you see the cops?" one woman whispered to her husband. "Karen's finally gone too far." George stopped by my porch again, grinning ear to ear. "Well, you survived the 911 stunt. I think you just made her look like a fool in front of half the block." "Yeah," I said, sipping my coffee, "but I have a feeling this isn't over." I was right. That night, I found a fresh letter taped to my front door, written in Karen's usual sharp handwriting. "You've humiliated me today, but this isn't the end. The HOA will take every step necessary to make you comply." I crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash. But as I did, I realized something important. Karen wasn't just fighting me anymore. She was fighting to keep her power. And the harder she pushed, the more cracks were starting to show. The following days were tense. Karen kept trying to regain her footing, sending more emails, posting nasty notes on the HOA bulletin board. even spreading rumors that I was anti-community. But something had shifted. Neighbors who once ignored me started waving when I passed by. A few even stopped to chat, telling me they admired the way I'd stood up to her. She's been running this place like her personal kingdom for too long, one man told me. It's about time someone called her out. That's when I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore, I was fighting for all of us. By the end of the week, I decided it was time to take the fight to her. If Karen wanted to play this game, I'd start digging into the HOA's finances and leadership. I had a hunch there were skeletons in that closet, and I was determined to find them. As I sat at my kitchen table that Friday night, surrounded by copies of HOA documents I'd requested from the county clerk, I knew the tide was about to turn. Karen had overplayed her hand, and now it was my move. After the 911 stunt, I realized that simply ignoring Karen wouldn't be enough. She thrived on fear, on making people bend under her so-called authority. If I wanted to stop her for good, I needed to hit her where it hurt her position as the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. That meant digging into the very foundation of her power. I started by requesting public records from the county clerk's office. Most people don't know that HOAs are legally required to keep detailed financial records and meeting minutes. When I showed up at the county building, the clerk handed me a thick stack of papers, each one stamped and dated. "Someone's been busy," she said with a raised brow. "You're not the first to ask about that HOA. You know, Karen's name has popped up in more complaints than I can count." I gave a slow smile. "That's good to know." That evening, I spread the documents across my kitchen table. It felt like piecing together a puzzle line after line of expenses, fees, and suspicious miscellaneous costs that didn't add up. For example, there was a $2,000 landscaping improvement fee that was paid directly to a company that, after a little digging, turned out to be owned by Karen's cousin. Then there were the legal consultation fees that appeared almost every month, even though no lawsuits had been filed in years. It was clear Karen had been dipping her hands into the HOA's coffers, using community funds like her personal piggy bank. The more I read, the angrier I got. It wasn't just about my fine anymore, it was about every family she'd bullied or overcharged. People had been paying ridiculous HOA dues, trusting that the money would go toward real improvements, while Karen used it to line her pockets. I knew I had to be careful, though. If I came at her too hard, she'd just try to spin the story and paint me as the bad guy. So, I started quietly talking to my neighbors. One by one, I shared what I'd found. George was the first person I showed the records to. He sat at my kitchen table, flipping through the papers with his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. "Good Lord," he muttered, tapping a page with his finger. "This woman's been bleeding us dry. Look at this charging $500 for mailbox repairs. My mailbox hasn't been touched in years." "Exactly," I said. "She's been scamming all of us, and I think it's time we let the neighborhood know." George leaned back, a slow grin spreading across his face. "You're about to give her a fight she won't forget." We spent the next few days gathering more evidence. I reached out to a few other neighbors who'd been burned by Karen's petty rules, and they were quick to join the cause. One couple showed me a letter Karen sent last year, threatening to fine them $150 for having improperly colored curtains. Another neighbor shared a story about how Karen charged them a late fee on HOA dues, even though they'd already paid on time when they asked for proof. She claimed the records had been lost. By the time the week ended, I had a folder full of documents, letters, and statements from at least 6 families. Karen's empire wasn't just cracking, it was about to collapse. The turning point came when I found a series of emails buried in the HOA records. They were supposed to be private board communications, but someone, likely a past board member, had left them attached to the official meeting minutes. In those emails, Karen openly bragged about keeping residents in line and joked about raising fines to make up for last month's shopping trip. Reading her words in black and white made my blood boil. I knew I couldn't just sit on this, so I started preparing for the next HOA meeting. But this time, I wouldn't be going in alone. I planned to show up with every document I had, every piece of proof of her misuse of funds and power. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. I sat on my porch, watching the stars, sipping a whiskey instead of my usual coffee. Part of me wondered if I was ready for the storm I was about to unleash. Karen wasn't the type to go down quietly, and I knew she'd fight dirty. But I also knew I had something she didn't truth, and the truth, once it came out, would burn her entire kingdom to the ground. The next day, I put all my files into a neat binder, labeling each section financial irregularities, unapproved fines, resident complaints, and Karen's emails. Just holding that binder felt like holding a loaded weapon. As I closed the cover and looked out at my freshly mowed lawn, cut exactly how I wanted, not how Karen demanded, I felt a sense of calm. Tomorrow, I'd stand in front of everyone and expose her for who she really was. The day of the HOA meeting arrived like a storm cloud I'd been watching creep across the horizon. I wasn't nervous. I was ready. I had spent the morning double-checking every document, every page of evidence, until the binder I carried felt heavier than a law book. By 6 p.m., the community hall was already buzzing. People sat in folding chairs, whispering to each other, most of them probably expecting another dull meeting about landscaping or mailbox paint colors. Karen stood at the front of the room, her hair perfectly styled, her lips stretched into that forced smile she wore when she thought she was in control. "Welcome, neighbors," she began, tapping the microphone like she was hosting a press conference. "Tonight, we have several important issues to discuss, starting with a certain resident who continues to violate our community standards." All eyes turned toward me. I could feel the weight of their stares, but I didn't flinch. I walked up to the front row, set my binder on the table, and crossed my arms. "Funny you should bring me up first. Karen," I said loud enough for everyone to hear, "because I've got a few things to share, too." Her smile faltered. "Mr. Thompson, this isn't—" I held up a hand. "Oh, this is exactly the right time." I flipped open the binder and pulled out the first page, a copy of her so-called fine notice, complete with her handwriting and 0 official board signatures. This is the kind of garbage Karen's been using to threaten me. But it's not just me, is it? I turned to the room. "How many of you have gotten one of these?" There was a murmur as a few hands went up. George, the Ramirez couple, even the Johnsons, who usually kept to themselves. "Thought so." I said, "Now, let's talk about where your HOA dues are really going." I laid out the evidence, one piece at a time: the landscaping improvements paid to her cousin's company, the so-called legal consultation fees that were nothing more than personal expenses, the emails where Karen openly mocked residents and bragged about raising fines for fun. With each page I read, the room grew quieter, the tension thicker. By the time I reached the part about her shopping trips, people were shifting in their chairs, some openly glaring at her. "Karen," I said, my voice steady but sharp, "you've been using this HOA like your personal piggy bank. You've bullied your neighbors, misused their money, and called the cops over 2 inches of grass. And I'm done letting you get away with it." She tried to interrupt, her voice shaking. "This is all lies. He's twisting things." "Lies," I said, holding up the emails. "These are your words." "Karen, do you want me to read them out loud?" Her face went pale. George stood up then, his voice booming across the hall. "She fined me $200 for leaving my trash can out for 1 extra day. I paid it because I didn't want trouble, but now I see what she's been doing with our money. Enough is enough." The room erupted. Voices overlapped as more neighbors began to share their own stories: unfair fines, rude letters, threats. Karen's power was unraveling right there in front of everyone. Finally, Mrs. Ramirez stood, her tone firm but calm. "We need a vote. Karen's not fit to run this HOA anymore." Karen looked like she'd been slapped. "You can't do that." "Oh, yes we can," I said. "The bylaws give residents the right to call for a special vote when leadership is found misusing funds, and I think we've all seen enough tonight to warrant that." The vote happened right then and there. It wasn't even close. Karen was removed as HOA president, replaced by a temporary committee until a proper election could be held. She sat in her chair, stiff as a statue, her eyes burning holes into me. "You'll pay for this," she hissed as I walked past. I paused, leaning in just enough for only her to hear, "No, Karen, you will." That night, I walked home feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The neighbors who used to avoid eye contact now nodded at me, some even stopping to thank me for standing up to her. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She'd fight to keep what she thought was hers, even if it meant dragging the whole neighborhood down with her. The next morning, my hunch proved right. I saw a moving truck parked outside Karen's house, and she was on her front lawn, pacing with her phone glued to her ear. Something was wrong, and I had a feeling it was about to get very interesting. The morning after Karen's downfall at the HOA meeting, I expected her to lay low. Maybe she'd cool off, lick her wounds, and figure out a way to save face. But Karen wasn't wired that way. When I saw her pacing in front of her house, phone pressed to her ear, I knew something was brewing. I walked down my driveway, coffee in hand, just in time to hear her shouting into the phone, "What do you mean the payment didn't clear? I sent it last week." Her voice cracked with panic. A few minutes later, a man in a dark suit stepped out of a black sedan parked by the curb. He looked official too official. He knocked on Karen's door, holding a clipboard and a thick envelope. When she opened the door, I watched his expression stay stone cold as he handed her a paper. Karen froze, her jaw dropping. This must be a mistake, she yelled, clutching the paper like it was a death notice. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over to George's fence, where he was already leaning with that knowing grin. "What's going on?" I asked. He chuckled. "Word is, Karen's behind on her mortgage. That guy probably from the bank. Looks like the queen bee hasn't been paying her own bills while she's busy finding the rest of us." I sipped my coffee, letting the irony sink in. Well, I guess tables really do turn. By midday, the whole neighborhood was buzzing. Rumors spread faster than wildfire. One neighbor claimed Karen had drained HOA funds to cover personal expenses and now couldn't make her house payments. Another swore they saw the same man from the bank putting papers on her door, foreclosure notices. I didn't take any of it at face value until I saw it with my own eyes. That afternoon, as I was mowing my freshly cut lawn just to rub it in, I spotted a bright orange foreclosure notice taped to Karen's front door. The bold letters read, "Final notice property in default." Karen ripped it down as soon as she spotted me looking, her face red with fury. "Don't you dare look at my house like that." "Thompson," she screamed. "Hey, I'm just mowing my lawn," I said with a grin. You know, following the rules and all. The next few days were chaos for Karen. The HOA board, what was left of it, started investigating her misuse of funds. The temporary committee requested a full audit, and every shady transaction I'd uncovered was now public record. Neighbors who once feared her now avoided her like the plague. Some even laughed behind her back. One evening, as I walked my dog down the street, I heard the Ramirez couple talking. She fined us $300 for leaving a Halloween decoration out too long. "Mrs. Ramirez whispered, "Now look at her about to lose her house, justice." "Mr. Ramirez said, shaking his head. "Pure justice." Karen tried to push back. She sent angry emails to the neighborhood, blaming me for ruining her life. She claimed I had orchestrated some conspiracy against her, but her words no longer carried weight. People saw her for what she truly was, a bully who'd been caught in her own lies. A week later, I spotted another visit from the man in the dark suit. This time, he wasn't alone. There were 2 deputies with him. They taped another document to Karen's door while she shouted at them, her voice breaking into desperate pleas. George and I watched from across the street. "This is it," he muttered. "She's not talking her way out of this one." Karen spotted us watching and shouted, "This isn't over. You'll regret this. All of you." George laughed softly. She still thinks she's the hero of this story. By now, I wasn't angry at Karen anymore. I was almost pitying her. Almost. She'd built her entire identity around being in control. And now, not only had she lost her HOA throne, but she was also about to lose her own house. The evening before her eviction notice was due, I sat on my porch, looking across the street at her house. Lights were still on in every room, and I could see her pacing back and forth, probably making one last desperate call to the bank. I leaned back in my chair, sipping a cold beer, and thought about everything that had led us here. All the letters, the threats, the 911 call. It all seemed like a bad dream now, but tomorrow would bring the final blow. The next morning, when I saw the sheriff's truck pull up with movers following behind, I knew it was over. Karen came outside, frantic, waving her arms, but the deputies were unmoved. They handed her the final paperwork, and within an hour she was loading her SUV with boxes. The morning Karen's world finally collapsed was eerily quiet. I was sitting on my porch with my coffee, watching the sun climb over the rooftops, when I saw the sheriff's truck roll into our neighborhood. Behind it came a flatbed moving van and a car marked with the bank's logo. My gut told me this was it. Karen's reign of terror was about to end. I watched from across the street as two deputies stepped out, one of them carrying a clipboard and the other a roll of bright orange tape. They walked up to Karen's door and knocked. For a moment, there was silence. Then the door flung open, and there she was, still dressed in that stiff blazer-like jacket she wore at HOA meetings. But her face looked pale and hollow. "This is a mistake," she cried. "I have rights. You can't do this to me." The deputy calmly handed her the official foreclosure papers. "Ma'am, your property has been repossessed by the bank. You have 30 minutes to vacate the premises. Do you have any personal belongings you want to take with you?" Now Karen's voice cracked. "This is my home. I've been here for 15 years. Then you should have paid your mortgage," I muttered under my breath, though I kept my tone low enough so only George, who had joined me on my porch, could hear. The neighbors started gathering, one by one. People peeked from windows. Some whispered on their front lawns. Even the Ramirez kids stopped riding their bikes to watch. The woman who had once intimidated the entire street was now begging, pacing like a caged animal. I felt something strange watching it all unfold, a mix of satisfaction and pity. Karen had brought this on herself, but seeing her desperation reminded me that, for all her arrogance, she was still human. "Think she'll apologize?" George asked, leaning on the porch railing. I smirked. Not a chance. She's the type who'll go down swinging. Sure enough, Karen turned toward us, eyes blazing. "This is your fault. Thompson, you and your little rebellion have ruined my life. I didn't even stand up." "No. Karen," I said evenly, "you did this to yourself. You bullied everyone here, and now you're paying the price. It's called accountability." She let out a guttural scream before slamming her door. But minutes later, the deputies had her outside again, watching as the movers carried out box after box of her belongings. It was surreal, like watching a queen stripped of her crown. By noon, the bank's crew had changed the locks and taped the foreclosure notice to the door. The bright orange paper flapped in the summer breeze for everyone to see. Karen stood there, defeated, clutching the last box of her belongings, her SUV packed to the brim. As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Ramirez approached her with surprising kindness. "Karen," she said softly, "maybe this is a chance for you to start over. Somewhere new." Karen turned to her with tears in her eyes, but her pride wouldn't let her answer. She just shook her head, slammed the SUV door, and sped away, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust behind her. That night, the street felt different, lighter, calmer, like a weight had been lifted off everyone's shoulders. Neighbors came out, some for the first time in months, talking and laughing in their driveways. George brought over a six-pack, and we sat on my porch, toasting to the end of Karen's tyranny. "You really did it," George said. "You stood up to her. And now look peace and quiet." I chuckled, taking a sip of beer. I didn't do it alone. She did most of the work herself. All I did was hold up a mirror. Later, as the sun set and the neighborhood grew quiet again, I found myself staring at Karen's now empty house. It looked so different without her there, like the building itself could finally breathe. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a victory. It was a reminder of what happens when someone abuses power for too long. The following morning, the temporary HOA committee sent out a notice thanking the residents for their patience and promising fairer, more transparent leadership going forward. For the first time in years, People felt like their voices mattered. And I'll admit, it felt good knowing I had a hand in that. Still, I knew there was one last thing I needed to do to share what I'd learned from all this madness. Because if Karen's downfall taught me anything, it was that standing your ground isn't just about stubbornness. It's about doing what's right, no matter how loud the bullies shout. The day after Karen's SUV vanished down the street for the last time, I woke to a silence that felt almost foreign. No angry emails, no threatening notes on my door, no shrill voice echoing through the neighborhood. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. As I sat on my porch with my morning coffee, I watched neighbors walking their dogs and kids riding their bikes. Without Karen patrolling the streets with her clipboard, the place finally felt like a community again, not a dictatorship. People waved at me, smiling, and some even stopped to thank me. "You did what none of us dared to do," Mrs. Ramirez said, holding a basket of fresh muffins she'd baked. "You stood up to her. Now we can all breathe easier." I accepted the muffins with a grin. I didn't do it just for me, I said. She had everyone scared, and that's no way to live. That evening, the temporary HOA committee invited me to a meeting. They wanted my input on rewriting the rules and making the HOA fair again. "We've realized this community needs transparency," one of the new board members said. "Karen ran things like her own private fiefdom. We want everyone to have a voice now." It felt good to hear that, but I made one thing clear. I'm not here to replace Karen. I just want to live in peace, like everyone else. If you want my advice, keep things simple. No more crazy fines over grass height or curtain colors. Let people enjoy their homes. They nodded in agreement. And, for once, I believed them. As the weeks passed, Karen's house was put up for sale. I saw potential buyers touring the place, their footsteps echoing in what had once been her fortress of control. It was poetic justice. Karen had tried to rule everyone's property, and in the end, she couldn't even keep her own. George and I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and gold. He cracked open a cold beer and handed it to me. "You know," he said, "this neighborhood owes you more than just thanks. You didn't just stand up to Karen, you reminded all of us that we have rights, that we can say no when something's wrong." I took a slow sip, feeling the warmth of his words. I didn't do it alone. It took all of us speaking up. I just happened to be the guy stubborn enough to start. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail from the bank confirming that Karen's foreclosure had gone through. It was official. Her reign was over for good. I folded the letter and slipped it into my binder, the same binder I'd used to take her down. It felt like closing the final chapter of a book I never wanted to read in the first place. Looking back, I realized something important. Standing up to Karen wasn't just about defying her fines or calling her bluff. It was about restoring balance, about showing the neighborhood that fear only wins when you let it. I thought about my dad, who used to say, "Right is right, even if you stand alone." Maybe that's what gave me the backbone to keep pushing, even when Karen called 911 or tried to humiliate me in front of everyone. One quiet Sunday morning, I took a walk past Karen's old house. A for sale sign stood proudly in the front yard, and for a moment, I stopped to take it in. The place looked different without her, a little worn. Maybe, but also free. I couldn't help but smile as I turned back toward my own home, where the grass grew just how I liked it. No one to measure it, no one to threaten me over it, just peace. Before heading inside, I sat on my porch for a long moment, letting the breeze brush across my face. This whole ordeal had been exhausting, but it had also been worth it, not just because Karen had been stopped, but because the neighborhood was stronger now. We weren't just strangers living side by side anymore. We were neighbors, real ones. I decided to end the night with a message to anyone listening, whether it was through the story I'd tell my kids or the folks who stopped by to ask about that HOA drama. Don't let bullies win, I'd say. Whether they're hiding behind rules or titles, they only have power if you let them. Stand your ground. Do what's right. And remember, justice has a way of finding its way back around. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the fireflies started blinking in the fields beyond my backyard, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. Karen was gone, but the lesson she left behind would stay with us all. When I look back at everything that happened, I realize it wasn't just about me and Karen. It was about standing up when something isn't right. Even if it feels like the whole world is against you, Karen thought she could control everyone with her rules, her threats, and her fake fines. But the truth always catches up. In the end, her house, the one place she thought was untouchable, was taken away, not because of me, but because of her own choices. This story isn't just about revenge. It's about justice. It's about the quiet strength it takes to say no when someone tries to push you down. And it's about knowing that, no matter how powerful someone pretends to be, they can't stand against a community that decides enough is enough. If you've ever had to deal with a Karen like this, I hope my story reminds you that you're not alone, and that sometimes the best way to win is simply to hold your ground. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found it as satisfying as I did, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and let me know in the comments if you've ever faced a battle like this. Together, we can keep standing up for what's right.